Boone hadn't been looking for anyone. He was following horse tracks, old ones, half buried under wind-blown dust and scattered sage. Somewhere up ahead, a man who owed him money was riding too slow, or too cocky, or just plain ready to be found. But then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Sunset streaking the dry horizon, warping shape and shadow. But no, there she was, barefoot, dust-covered, chained to a tree like a broken animal someone had no more use for. Her dress was torn at the hem, her shoulders sunburned raw. She didn't look up when he stopped, didn't beg, didn't speak, just sat there with her wrists wrapped in rusted iron, breathing quiet like she'd already run out of hope hours ago. Boone didn't say a word either. He just knelt, took the chain in his hand, and started to work. Boone didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to. The answer was already in the dirt around her, in the way the ground bore no other footprints near the tree, just wagon ruts veering off north and horse droppings left cold and forgotten. Whoever left her hadn't meant to come back. The chain was tight around her wrists, rusted and red where it had rubbed raw. Her dress, once the color of green cotton, was sun-faded and worn thin at the seams. She hadn't spoken since he'd found her, just stared past him, unmoving, while the wind toyed with a strand of her hair like it wasn't tied to anything human. Boone knelt beside her. The sun had almost slipped beneath the far hills, and the shadows had begun to reach like long fingers across the brush. It would be dark soon. He pulled a small iron rod from the saddlebag and slid it into the shackle's lock. "I ain't got the key," he said in a low voice, "but this'll do." Still no reply, not even a blink. With a soft click, the cuff loosened. Her arms dropped forward, heavy, like she hadn't expected them to be free. She didn't run, didn't move at all, just sat there as he worked the chain from around her waist and finally the one at her ankles. When it was done, he didn't speak, didn't offer his hand. He stood, took a slow step back, and gave her the space he figured no one else had for a long while. "Name's Boone," he said simply. Nothing. He nodded once as if to say that was fine, then turned to walk back to his horse. She didn't speak that night, even as he made a small fire off the trail and offered her a tin cup of water. She sat on the other side of the flames, her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them like they were the last things keeping her from unraveling. Boone didn't press. He'd known men like that, the ones who asked too many questions too soon. He wasn't one of them. He ate quietly, handed her half a biscuit wrapped in cloth, and left his bedroll closer to the fire in case she needed the warmth. She didn't take it, but she didn't run either. At some point before dawn, he woke to find her sitting upright, eyes open, watching the stars like she'd been counting them all night. In the morning, he saddled his horse and waited. She didn't move until he said, "I'm headed west, toward Valewood. Got a cousin runs a small cattle stop." She looked at him, not scared, not desperate, just tired. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Didn't figure you were." "I don't have anything." "You got a name?" She hesitated, then, "Lorna." Boone gave a short nod. "Well, Lorna, I've got one horse, half a canteen, and a long road through dry country. You're welcome to ride part of it." She didn't answer right away, but she stood, walked to him, and when he offered his hand this time, she took it. The first 2 days were quiet. Boone didn't ask questions. Lorna didn't offer much. She rode behind him, arms around his waist only when the terrain forced her close. Otherwise, she kept distance. Even when they made camp, she chose the opposite side of whatever rock or tree broke the wind that night. But Boone watched, and what he saw wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Like she was rationing pieces of herself until she knew they'd be safe to give. He respected that. It was on the third evening, as they approached a shallow creek bed, that she finally spoke more than 2 words. Boone had stopped to let the horse drink. Lorna sat on a boulder nearby, bare feet in the water, rubbing at the bruises where the shackles had bitten deep. "You didn't ask why they left me," she said. Boone was quiet for a moment. "I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." She looked down at her feet. It was a wagon train. Not settlers. Not really. More like buyers. Men who thought women came cheap if they were desperate enough. He didn't speak. They sent for me. Promised land. A name. I believed it. Boone's jaw tightened. You weren't the first. Number, but I was the loudest. Asked too many questions. Stopped smiling when they wanted me to. She pulled her feet from the water and dried them on the hem of her dress. They chained me up after I broke one of their whiskey bottles over a man's head. Boone gave a slow, grim nod. Then you're still alive because you fought back. She looked at him then, for the first time really looked, not like a stranger, like someone who might stay. They reached Valewood 5 days later, a dusty one-street town with a half-collapsed saloon, a crooked church steeple, and a general store that sold everything but grace. Boone's cousin, Amos, ran cattle out of a fenced basin east of town. He welcomed Boone with a rough hug and a strong drink, and barely raised an eyebrow when Lorna stepped down from the horse and stretched her stiff legs. Boone didn't introduce her. Lorna didn't offer a title, and Amos, to his credit, didn't ask. They stayed 3 days. Lorna helped Amos's wife, June, with the kitchen, though she never said much. But the way she chopped onions and stirred the cornbread batter told June enough. This one's been hurt, she whispered to Boone on the second day. But she ain't broken. Boone only nodded. I know. On the morning they left, June packed a small cloth bundle of food and handed it to Lorna. I don't know where you're headed, sweetheart, she said, but I hope wherever it is, nobody tries to name you before you get there. Lorna smiled, and for the first time since Boone had found her, it reached her eyes. They rode west again, not because they had a destination, but because they had agreed, without saying it, that the road itself was safer than any place they'd left behind. And this time, when they made camp, Lorna sat beside him, not across, not apart, just beside. The road west was flatter now. The hard ridgelines of New Mexico gave way to rolling stretches of golden grass, burned at the tips by sun and time. Boone rode with his hat tilted low, one hand on the reins, the other resting lazily near the horn of his saddle. Lorna rode her own mount now. Amos had offered her an old sorrel mare with a slow gait and calm eyes. She hadn't said much when she took it, just stroked the animal's muzzle and said, You and me both. They rode in silence most of the time, not because they had nothing to say, but because the quiet between them had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't afraid. It was full of breath and space, and a kind of shared rhythm that didn't need words to make sense. But Boone noticed things. The way she looked over her shoulder every few miles, not in fear but habit. The way she flinched slightly at the sound of metal scraping, pots, tools, even a loose horseshoe. And the way her voice caught sometimes, like the words wanted out but hadn't yet been told they were allowed. He didn't push. Instead, he offered her steadiness. One morning, when they stopped near a dried-up creek bed to water the horses, Lorna sat beside him and reached for the canteen without asking. That was new. She took a long drink, wiped her mouth on the back of her wrist, and said, It still doesn't feel real. Boone looked at her. What doesn't? That I can move. That no one's pulling me back. That I can look at a tree and not wonder if someone's going to chain me to it. She said it plainly, no dramatics, no trembling lip. Boone nodded. It'll take time. I'm tired of time, she said. It never did anything but pass. He offered her a piece of jerky. She took it without hesitation. That was new too. That night they made camp under a sky so clear it felt like the stars might fall straight down and shatter on their skin. Boone sat sharpening his knife against a flat stone. Lorna sat across the fire, pulling loose threads from the hem of her dress. It was the same one he'd found her in. Amos's wife had washed it, patched the tear along the side, but it still bore the faint stain of rust and sun and something older. You should let it go, he said gently. She looked up. The dress. I can't, she said. Not yet. Boone didn't press, but he understood. Sometimes the things that held us captive are the same things we keep just to prove we lived through them. 2 days later, they came across a burned-out wagon off the trail. Boone spotted it first. Blackened wood, wheels half sunk into the earth, buzzards circling lazily overhead. He dismounted, checked the ground. No bodies, just the smell of smoke and the memory of panic. Lorna didn't follow at first, but eventually she came to stand beside him. She didn't ask whose it had been. She just said, They never look behind, do they? No, They just set fire to whatever they don't want to explain. Boone brushed ash from the remains of a metal pot and straightened. You want to keep going? Lorna shook her head. Number I want to sit a while. And so they did, together. Right there in the ruins of someone else's story, they made their own kind of pause. That night Lorna cooked. It wasn't much, just beans with wild onion and a touch of salt. But Boone couldn't remember the last time food had felt like a gift. He thanked her. She looked surprised. Most men just eat. I'm not most men. No, she said softly. You're not. They came to a crossroads the next day. Literally, a split in the trail. One path led toward the mining towns and busy rails of the north, the other west, toward canyon lands and silence. Boone reined in his horse. Well, he said, your pick. Lorna blinked. You're letting me decide? Always was. She didn't speak for a while. Then slowly, she turned her horse west, and he followed. No questions, no explanations. Just the trust that had been earned, mile by mile. Later that week, under a wide cottonwood tree, Boone handed her a bundle wrapped in oilskin. What's this? Something June asked me to give you when the time was right. Lorna unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a dress, soft linen, sky blue, no chains, just buttons. She held it for a long time, then looked up. I'm not ready. You don't have to be. But I think I want to be. Boone nodded. That's all that matters. That night, as the fire died low, Lorna spoke first. Do you believe people can start over? Boone stared into the embers. I think starting over is just deciding to keep walking when the world told you to stop. She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. A real one, not small, not polite, but the kind that said something inside her had finally unclenched. I like that, she said. Boone tipped his hat lower. So do I. And when she lay down that night beside the fire, she didn't keep her boots on. She didn't sleep with one eye open. She didn't pull the blanket up to her chin like a shield. She just slept, free. Not because someone told her she was, but because she decided she was. They reached a riverbank by dusk, wide and slow-moving, the kind that carved time into the land more than it ever rushed against it. Boone dismounted first, stepping lightly onto the damp earth, letting his mare drink. Lorna stayed in the saddle longer, eyes scanning the trees beyond the water, hand resting near her thigh. Not on a weapon, just a habit, a reflex. I think we'll camp here, Boone said. There's cover, water, good ground. She nodded, slid down from her horse, and landed with more grace than the girl he'd first unchained. He noticed. She didn't just stand, she stood, and then without a word she started unpacking the saddlebags. They moved easily now, like they'd done this 100 times. No orders, no questions. She gathered kindling. He set stones for the fire ring. By the time the flames caught, the sky had gone lavender, and the first few stars blinked open like eyes slowly waking. Boone roasted beans and passed the pan her way. She ate slow, measured. Then after the third bite, she said, I want a knife. Boone didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were steady. Any reason? I've earned one, she said, and that was enough. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small blade. Clean, nothing fancy, wood handle, well-balanced. He turned it in his palm once, then held it out. Lorna took it carefully, testing the weight, then nodded once and slid it into her boot. He didn't ask why she'd waited this long, and she didn't explain, because both of them knew. What she took back that night wasn't just steel, it was choice. The next day the wind shifted. Boone could smell smoke, not the kind from campfires, but dry grass catching fast. Somewhere south, a lightning storm must have sparked something. He mentioned it only once. We'll need to be mindful of wind tomorrow. Might be pushing fire. Lorna didn't panic. She just said, then we keep moving. Boone smiled a little. Look at you, making decisions. She smirked. Don't get used to it. But he already had. At a narrow pass between two hills, they came across a pair of travelers. An older couple heading east in a rickety wagon, pulled by a single mule. The man wore a bandage on his hand, and the woman looked like she hadn't slept in days. Their voices were clipped, grateful, cautious. Boone offered them coffee. Lorna offered them bread. The woman stared at Lorna's face a long while. "You from the Greenleaf train?" she asked. Lorna froze. Boone caught it. Just a flicker. But she answered before he could speak. "I was," she said. "Not anymore." The woman nodded, slowly. "Saw what they did, how they left you. I wanted to say something then." Lorna looked at her. "It's better you didn't." The woman looked ashamed, but Lorna added gently, "Now you've said it." And that was more grace than Boone had seen in a long while. That night she finally burned the dress. They didn't talk about it. She laid it across the fire like an offering, folded, neat, not angry, just done. And when the last hem curled to black and floated upward in ash, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since spring. She didn't just wear the blue dress. She stepped into it like someone stepping into their own skin. The fabric didn't just rest on her shoulders. It remembered the weight she no longer carried. Boone didn't ask what she'd wear next. She already had the blue dress June had sewn, and she wore it the next morning. No fuss, no mention, like she'd always meant to. They passed through a quiet valley dotted with juniper and stone. Birds called lazily from high branches. The land was soft again, forgiving, and Lorna sang. Only for a minute, a simple tune. No words, just a hum like wind through long grass. Boone didn't say a thing, but he smiled. And when she caught him watching, she rolled her eyes and said, "Don't get sentimental on me, Boone." Too late. By the end of the week, they came to a small ridge with a view of the canyon beyond. Below, a river, a stand of trees, a flat stretch of land kissed by late spring. Boone dismounted. Lorna did the same. He pointed to the slope. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. She tilted her head. "That's a good place for a house?" That's a good place for a garden." She smiled slowly. "Guess we'll need both." He nodded. "I reckon we will." They didn't call it a promise, but it was. That night the stars came early, and when Lorna laid down, she did so with her head on his coat, her boots beside hers, and the knife tucked in her waistband, not out of fear, but habit. She slept with her hand resting just inches from Boone's. And Boone? He didn't move a muscle, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not reach out, but be there when someone else finally does. The land hadn't changed. Same dusty ridge, same crooked juniper casting a half shadow at high noon. Even the tree was still there, its bark stripped clean where the chain had worn through, a scar carved into it by human hands and rusted iron. The grass hadn't regrown where her knees had pressed into the soil that day. Boone reined in his horse just before the rise and looked back at Lorna. "You sure?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just sat in the saddle, lips pressed tight, eyes locked on the place that once held her like property. But then, with a breath that seemed to echo down her spine, she nodded. "I'm sure." Boone didn't argue. He let her ride ahead. This was her moment, not his. The tree looked smaller now, less like a monument, more like what it really was, a crooked thing still standing in the middle of nowhere, even after everything. Lorna dismounted without a sound. She tied the horse's reins loosely to a low branch, though it didn't try to wander. Then she stepped to the exact patch of dirt where her chains had been unfastened, and stood, arms by her sides, back straight, no fear, no shame, just presence. Boone stayed back, watching, protecting, not interrupting. Minutes passed, maybe more. She didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed. Then finally she bent down, dug her fingers into the earth, and pulled something loose. A broken metal ring, half buried in the dust. The last link. She turned it over in her hand, stared at it, and then, without ceremony, tossed it over her shoulder like it was nothing more than a stone. It landed with a soft thud. She didn't look back. They made camp that night in a dry riverbed a few miles west. Lorna sat beside the fire, scraping dried meat with her knife. Boone poured coffee into their cups. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was full. Finally, she said, "I thought I'd feel something." Boone looked up. "And I don't," she admitted. "Or maybe I feel everything. He nodded slowly. That's how you know you're not carrying it anymore. She smiled faintly. Number, I think now it's carrying me. Later, as the fire crackled low, Lorna unwrapped a cloth from her saddlebag, one she hadn't touched in weeks. Inside was the blue dress. She smoothed it in her lap, then folded it carefully and placed it near the fire to warm. They passed 2 riders on the trail the next morning. Men from the same route where she'd once been chained. They glanced at Boone, then at Lorna, then kept moving. She stood still, not flinching, not shrinking, just watching them ride away like they meant nothing. One of the men turned in his saddle as they rode off. Boone noticed. So did she. But neither of them slowed. Later that day, they came to a town neither of them had heard of. Just a few buildings. A feed store. A saloon. A chapel with half its roof missing. Lorna tied her mare outside the store and stepped in ahead of Boone. She bought coffee, flour, a new comb. The woman behind the counter asked, "What name should I write it under?" Lorna hesitated. Then she said, "Write it under Boone." Boone blinked. She turned to him and shrugged. "I figured I've carried enough names that weren't mine." He smiled. "I don't mind lending this one." She nodded. "Just don't expect me to give it back." They camped by the edge of an old orchard that night. Gnarled trees still offered a few hard apples, and Lorna picked 3, polishing one on her sleeve before biting in. Boone sat beside her, slicing wood with his knife. She leaned against him gently. He didn't move away, and for the first time she spoke his name like a promise. "Boone? Yeah? I want to stay somewhere." He looked at her, not surprised, just waiting. "Somewhere quiet," she added. "Not because I'm hiding, just because I want to grow something." He took her hand. "You already are." They didn't plan to stop there. It was just another clearing off the trail. 3 maples bent by wind, a dry well, and the skeleton of what had once been a barn. The boards had fallen inward, like the structure was trying to protect itself from time. Grass grew in wild patches along the edges, curling around rusted tools and stone foundations long abandoned. But something about it made Lorna stop her horse. Boone reined in beside her. "Something wrong?" "No," she said, her voice quiet. "Something right." She dismounted, walked slowly toward the crumbling barn. Boone followed, not asking. Inside it smelled of dust and old things, but the air was still, peaceful. "There used to be people here," she said. "Probably still ghosts," Boone added, only half joking. She ran her fingers along one of the standing beams. "I don't mind ghosts," she said, "as long as they don't try to name me." He smiled faintly, and then she said it, without ceremony. "I want to stay here." Boone looked around. "There's not much left." "There's enough." And there was. They spent the first 2 days clearing brush. Boone repaired the barn wall that still stood. Lorna found an old wooden trough and filled it with dirt, planting wildflowers she'd gathered along the trail. The dry well turned out to be deeper than expected. Boone cleaned it out and found the water table still alive, just buried under neglect. "Like everything else out here," he said. She smiled. "Not buried, waiting." On the 3rd morning, Lorna woke early. She walked barefoot across the cold floor of the old storage shed they were using for shelter and stepped into the light like she was claiming it. Boone watched her. She wasn't the woman he'd found beneath that tree. She stood straighter now, taller even. She wore the blue dress again, creased from sleep, but hers. Not borrowed, not forced, chosen. She knelt by the base of the maple tree closest to the well and began to dig. Not deep, just enough. Then from the inside of her boot she pulled a stone. The rusted shackle link, the one she'd tossed months ago, had never truly left her. She'd kept it. She placed it in the hole, and on top of it, she set a flat river stone. Boone came beside her. "What's that for?" "A name," she said. "I thought you didn't want one written down." "I don't," she replied, "but the ground will remember." They built slowly, not out of laziness, but care. 1 beam a day, a roof line measured by the stars, a garden planned around the way the wind moved through the trees. Boone taught her to thatch a roof. Lorna taught him how to keep rabbits out of carrot beds using wire and dried tobacco. Each night they sat by a fire, Some nights they talked. Some nights they didn't. But their silence was never empty. It held them like a house holds light. One evening after finishing the north wall of the house, Lorna stood in the doorway frame and looked out across their new land. It was rough, still half wild, but so was she. Boone came to stand beside her. "You think it'll last?" she asked. He looked across the field, then at her. "You already did." She didn't respond, just stepped down into the grass and knelt again. This time she planted seeds: sunflower, wild oat, mint. Boone didn't ask why those. She had her reasons. And as she covered the dirt gently with her palms, she whispered something so soft he almost didn't catch it. "I don't need anyone else to say it." He didn't ask what. She looked up. "I know who I am." Boone knelt beside her, pressing his fingers into the earth beside hers. "And if you ever forget," he said, "I'll remind you." The wind rose, but it didn't unsettle. It carried, like breath, like beginning. And in that place, between ruin and roots, Lorna pressed her palms into the dirt like it could carry memory. She didn't plant herself. She simply stopped running. And for the first time, the land didn't just hold her. It answered her back. Not with words, but with warmth. And with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew. She had become something no one could unmake. The morning started like any other. Low sun, dew clinging to grass blades, the smell of smoke and biscuits drifting from the porch where Lorna had set a pan to warm. Boone stood by the fence line, fixing a loose post with slow, practiced hands. He didn't look up when she stepped outside, but he knew she was there. He always did. She poured him coffee, not because he asked, but because she wanted to. He took it wordlessly, drank, and leaned against the fence. "You know," she said, squinting at the line of trees beyond the creek. "It's strange." "What is?" "I was chained to a tree once. Thought I'd never move again." Boone sipped his coffee. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I grow roots by choice." He glanced sideways at her. "That's how you know it's yours." Later that day, they rode into town for supplies. It wasn't a special occasion, just flour, sugar, nails. But the town felt different now. People greeted them with nods, not whispers. The man who once called Boone the quiet one with a past now asked him about fencing tools. A girl in braids asked Lorna how she got her hair so shiny. She didn't answer, but she handed the girl a bar of soap wrapped in twine. "Boiled rosemary," she said simply. The girl beamed, and Lorna, without meaning to, smiled back. On the way home, they passed the ridge where the land dipped into shallow hills. There was nothing there but wind and distance, but Lorna pulled her horse to a stop. Boone did too. She stared out over the open land, the kind of empty that used to make her feel small. Not anymore. "Do you think they remember?" she asked softly. "Who?" "The ones who left me." Boone was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It doesn't matter." She nodded. "You're right." Then after a beat, "But I do." She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like a truth. That night the air was thick with summer. They didn't light a fire. Too hot. Instead, they sat in the doorway of their small house, the one they'd built board by board. Lorna rested her feet on Boone's lap, and he traced slow circles along her ankle with calloused fingers. She wore the same blue dress, not because she had to, because she liked the way it moved when the wind passed through it. Boone looked at her like he had 100 times, but this time he said, "I want to tell you something." She raised an eyebrow. "This the part where you propose?" He chuckled. "Number this the part where I say, I'd still be riding if I hadn't stopped that day." "At the tree?" He nodded. "I thought I was tracking a man." "You found a woman." He looked her in the eyes. "I found home." She swallowed hard and leaned forward to press her forehead to his. They stayed like that a long time. No kiss, no music, just breath and belonging. Seasons changed. The house stood strong. So did she. They planted more than food: orchids, squash, lavender. Lorna learned to shape horseshoes beside Boone. He learned to make jam. Neighbors began to visit, not out of obligation, but comfort. One boy who had never known his mother sat on Lorna's porch. He looked up at her with dirt-smudged cheeks and wide, uncertain eyes. "What's your real name?" he asked. Lorna paused. Then she smiled, reached out, and gently touched his cheek. "It's the one I gave myself," she said. The boy blinked, then nodded. He didn't ask again, because that answer was more than enough. Years passed. The garden flourished. So did they. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but with mornings shared, paths cleared, rooms added. One day Boone came in with a cut on his arm and a sheepish grin. Lorna patched it up, grumbling the whole time. "You're supposed to be smarter than barbed wire. You're supposed to be less beautiful when you're angry." She swatted his shoulder. He winced and grinned wider. Eventually, people stopped calling her that girl who was left behind. They started saying Lorna, the one with the garden, or Boone's wife with the steady hand. But Boone always knew better. She wasn't defined by him, or the house, or even the land. She was defined by what she had refused to let die in herself, and that, Boone thought, was what made her unforgettable. The final scene was simple. She stood in the field one morning, hands muddy, knees in the dirt, planting again, not because she needed to, but because she could. Boone watched from the porch, and when she looked up, he waved once. She waved back and smiled. The wind moved gently through her dress, and the earth, for the first time, didn't pull her down. It held her, because she belonged now, not to a man, not to a past, but to herself, and to a place where someone had seen her. Not as a burden, not as a ghost, but as a life worth remembering. Some women are remembered for what they endured, others for how they endured it. Lorna was never meant to be remembered at all. She was meant to disappear beneath the weight of iron, silence, and the kind of shame that doesn't leave bruises, but still lingers in the blood. The men who left her chained to that tree never imagined she'd stand again, let alone walk away. They thought they were writing her ending. They didn't know she'd rewrite it, not with revenge, not with fire, but with a garden, with quiet mornings, with the man who never asked for her story, but stayed long enough to become part of it. Boone never claimed to be a savior. He didn't carry Lorna out of the dark. He simply walked beside her until she could see in it. He didn't fix her. He didn't tell her how to heal. He just stayed. And in doing so, he became the kind of man stories don't warn you about. The kind who listens, who waits, who builds. And together they didn't start over. They started forward. With names they chose, with land that held them, with a home not made of wood and nails, but of shared breath and second chances. So maybe this story was never about what she survived. Maybe it was about what she chose afterward. Not revenge, not erasing the past, but turning toward it, unflinching, and saying, "You don't get to keep me." She didn't escape into someone else's life. She built her own. And Boone? He didn't save her. He stayed, which some say is the harder thing. But Lorna? She didn't need saving. She just needed someone who wouldn't look away. And that, more than anything, made her unforgettable. The wind whispered through the dry pines, carrying the brittle scent of dust and dying leaves. Silas Boone leaned against the porch rail of his small, weathered cabin, his eyes fixed on the jagged line of the distant hills. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the gnarled tree beside his wife's unmarked grave. A simple stone, no name, just a heart carved into cedar. 15 winters, he thought, fingers curling around the rough wood. 15 years of silence, of empty nights and mornings that crept by like slow water. He adjusted his hat, the brim casting a shadow across his weathered face, and turned back inside. The fire had long gone cold and the air felt thin, stripped bare by years of loss. As he crossed the threshold, his boots thudding against the creaking boards, he paused. There, pinned to the wall beside the door, was a notice he had tacked up months ago, its edges curled with time. "Widow auction," it read, "tomorrow at noon." Silas closed the door behind him, his shadow stretching long across the cracked floorboards, the wind outside whispering of change. The wind had a different bite to it as Silas Boone rode down the main road into Larkspur. It cut through his coat, sharp and unrelenting, carrying the dry, bitter taste of autumn dust. His mule's hooves clopped against the hard-packed earth, the sound echoing against the warped boards of abandoned storefronts. The town looked as tired as he felt. lean, hollow, a place clinging to the edge of the prairie like a stubborn weed. Silas leaned slightly to favor his right leg as he dismounted outside the general store. The cold had settled deep into the old injury, making each step a reminder of a bullet long since dug out, but never truly gone. He adjusted his hat against the late afternoon glare, the sun casting long shadows across the rutted street, and nodded to old Matty Cobb, who sat whittling outside the store, his blade flashing in the brittle light. "Snow's coming early this year," Matty grumbled without looking up, his knife carving slow, steady curls from a block of pine. "Sky's too clear. Air's too dry." Silas didn't respond, just tipped his hat and pushed through the store's door, the small bell above it clanging like a tired church bell. The warmth inside wrapped around him, thick with the mingled scents of kerosene, tobacco, and molasses. Shelves crowded with canned goods, dried beans, and dusty sacks of flour lined the narrow aisles. He gathered what he needed quickly: salt, nails, lamp oil, then dropped them onto the counter, the wood creaking beneath the weight. As the clerk tallied his total, Silas's eyes drifted to the wooden post near the door, where a tattered sheet of paper hung, its edges frayed and curling like dead leaves. The ink had bled over time, the words written in a heavy hand: "Widow Auction. By order of Glencairn County Court. Name, Martha Greer. Date, tomorrow at noon." The words struck him like a stray shot. He hadn't thought of such things in years, not since his Clara had passed, and he'd buried both his heart and his hope beside her. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, a coldness that crept into his bones and stayed there. He paid the clerk, tucking his goods into a burlap sack, and stepped back into the street. The wind tugged at his coat, lifting the loose ends like a ghost's fingers. He glanced once more at the notice, the paper flapping in the breeze like the wing of a trapped bird. For a moment he considered tearing it down, crumpling it in his fist and letting it blow away with the dust. But he didn't. Just adjusted his hat and made his way back to his mule, the creak of his saddle a comfort against the rising storm of his thoughts. The road back to his ranch wound through dry, brittle fields, the grass rustling like dead parchment beneath the mule's slow steps. He passed the twisted remains of a barbed wire fence, its posts leaning like old men in the wind. At the top of the last rise, he paused. The house below stood squat and alone, a single chimney trailing thin smoke into the darkening sky. Beyond it, a single tree clung to the rocky soil, its branches twisted and scarred, a small stone marker nestled among the roots. Silas dismounted, leading the mule slowly down the slope, his leg protesting each step. He tied the reins to the hitching post near the porch, the wood groaning under the weight, then crossed the yard to the tree. He took off his hat, his breath misting in the cool air, and looked down at the simple marker. 15 winters, he whispered, his voice rough with disuse, and still I hear you when it rains. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves overhead, and he felt the weight of those lost years settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He knelt, his fingers brushing the rough grain of the carved cedar heart, tracing the grooves worn smooth by weather and time. He stayed that way for a long moment, letting the wind carry his breath away, before standing slowly, his joints creaking in protest. He turned back to the house, the windows dark and cold, the chimney smoke twisting like a question into the dimming sky. Inside, the cabin felt colder than the wind outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows against the log walls. Silas set his sack on the rough-hewn table, the wood scarred with years of knife marks and spilled whiskey, then struck a match to the hearth. The flames caught slowly, crackling as they licked at the dry kindling, the light pushing back the shadows but not the cold. He poured himself a tin cup of black coffee, the liquid bitter and thick as tar, then settled into his chair, his eyes drifting to the window. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose panes, the sky outside turning the color of old iron. He sipped the coffee, the heat biting at his tongue, and tried to ignore the paper still tacked to the wall by the door. The words echoed in his mind, unbidden but relentless. Widow Auction, Martha Greer, tomorrow at noon. He closed his eyes, the fire crackling softly beside him, the shadows creeping longer across the floorboards, and for the first time in years, He felt the old restlessness stir in his chest, a slow, uneasy burn, like an ember struggling to catch. The wind outside howled and he let it. The morning air was sharp, cutting through the mist that clung to the lowlands like a shroud. Silas saddled his mule in silence, his breath misting in the chill, the leather straps creaking as he tightened the cinch. The mule flicked its ears, sensing the unease in its rider. But Silas paid it no mind. His mind was elsewhere. Back in that small general store, the image of the auction notice still burned into his thoughts. As he mounted up, the sun broke over the ridge, its weak light casting long, jagged shadows across the frost-crusted ground. He tugged his coat tighter, the cold biting through the worn wool, and clicked his tongue to set the mule moving. The hooves clopped against the frozen earth, the sound carrying through the still air like the slow toll of a church bell. The ride into town felt longer this time, the road winding through brittle fields and skeletal trees, the branches bare and reaching like the hands of the desperate. Silas kept his eyes forward, the distant shape of Larkspur slowly growing against the pale morning sky, a cluster of low, sagging rooftops huddled against the coming winter. As he approached the outskirts, the first signs of life stirred. A thin line of smoke curling from the blacksmith's forge, the clang of hammer on iron echoing down the empty street. The general store's windows glowed faintly, the frost still clinging to the edges of the glass. Silas reined in his mule outside, dismounting slowly, his right leg stiff with the cold. He tied the reins to the hitching post, his fingers numb against the fraying rope, and stepped onto the cracked wooden sidewalk, his boots thudding against the planks. The town square lay just beyond, already stirring with the early risers, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, mothers calling their children in from the cold, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread mingling in the crisp air. But today a new tension hung in the air, a murmur of whispered conversations, eyes casting nervous glances toward the platform that had been hastily erected in the center of the square. Silas paused at the edge of the crowd, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. The platform was little more than a stack of old crates nailed together, the boards splintered and uneven, creaking under the weight of a thin, sour-faced man in a tan suit who paced back and forth, clutching a roll of parchment in one hand. Behind him, a thin rope had been strung between two posts, its rough fibers swaying gently in the morning breeze. The crowd shifted, boots scuffing against the frozen ground, eyes flicking between the platform and the road leading out of town. Silas's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He hadn't planned on coming, hadn't let himself consider it fully. But now that he was here, the choice felt inevitable, as if the road had led him here without his consent. A hush fell over the crowd as the thin man cleared his throat, his watery eyes scanning the assembled faces. He unrolled the parchment with a sharp flick, the paper crackling in the cold air. "Larkspur," he called, his voice thin but sharp, cutting through the morning quiet. "Thank you for gathering on this fine and lawful occasion. As ordered by the court of Glencairn County, the widow of the late Milton Greer is to be auctioned, her estate dissolved, and her person placed under the care of a respectable bidder." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, the murmurs growing louder. Silas felt his jaw clench, the muscles in his neck tightening. His eyes flicked to the edge of the platform, where a figure stepped slowly into view. Martha Greer. She wore gray, a simple, rough, spun dress that hung loose on her thin frame, her hair pinned back tightly, a few loose strands catching in the wind. She didn't meet the crowd's eyes, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond them, her face a mask of quiet defiance. She looked past them, over their heads into the distance, as if seeing something none of them could. Something she refused to look away from. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, a tightening in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He watched as the thin man in the tan suit droned on about debts and titles, his words sliding over the crowd like oil, thick and cloying. Offers came quickly. 2 goats and a milk cow from a rancher near the river. Weekly wages and a room behind a barber shop from the man who cut Silas's hair once a season. Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and mean, the sound of men enjoying the discomfort of another's shame. Silas felt the anger rise in him, slow and hot, burning away the cold that had settled into his bones. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the frost-hardened dirt, his breath misting in the air like smoke. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't let himself think it through, but the sight of Martha's thin shoulders, her chin lifted in quiet defiance, pulled him forward, step by slow, deliberate step. The auctioneer's voice faltered as Silas reached the base of the platform, his shadow stretching long across the splintered boards. The man's eyes flicked to him, his mouth twisting into a nervous smile. "Sir, are you—" "I'll take her," Silas said, his voice low, steady, the words carrying over the crowd like a challenge. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The crowd fell silent, the laughter dying in their throats, eyes turning to watch this quiet man with the limp and the iron in his spine. Martha's head turned slowly, her eyes finding his for the first time. She searched his face, her own expression unreadable, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair and pulling them across her cheek. Silas stepped closer, his boots clunking against the creaking boards. "She ain't livestock," he said, his voice rough but clear. "And I ain't bidding." The square went silent, the wind whispering through the brittle branches overhead, the sun casting thin, wavering shadows across the packed earth. The auctioneer opened his mouth, his parchment trembling in his hand, but Silas didn't wait for a response. He reached into his coat, his fingers closing around the worn folded deed to his land, and held it out, his eyes never leaving Martha's. "She marries me," he said, his voice a low, steady growl. "She gets my name, my land, my house, and I got no one left to give it to." The town square felt colder once the crowd dispersed, boots crunching against the frost-crusted dirt, muttered conversations trailing into the side streets like smoke. Silas stood beside the platform, his hands still wrapped around the folded deed, the rough paper warm from his grip. He hadn't looked at Martha since he'd spoken, hadn't let himself meet her eyes. Instead, he turned slowly, his limp more pronounced in the cold, and stepped down from the platform, the boards creaking beneath his weight. Martha followed, her footsteps light, her skirts whispering against the frozen ground. She moved like a shadow, quiet and unremarkable, slipping through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to being overlooked. She caught up to him as he reached his mule, her breath coming in short, white puffs in the chill air. He paused, his fingers tightening around the reins, the leather biting into his calloused palms. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice low but firm, the words cutting through the cold like a blade. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't turn, didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the mule's dark, patient eyes, the steam rising from its nostrils in slow, steady pulses. "I know," he replied, his voice rough, the words dragging against his throat. "But I couldn't stand there and watch them bid on you like a piece of furniture." Silence stretched between them, the sounds of the town fading into the background, the clatter of a blacksmith's hammer, the sharp cry of a child, the creak of a wagon wheel turning slowly down the main street. Martha's hands tightened around the worn fabric of her skirts, her fingers white against the gray wool. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her voice steady, each word carefully measured. "I won't be a burden." Silas's shoulders stiffened, his fingers flexing around the reins. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the platform. Her face was pale in the thin winter light, her eyes sharp and clear, the lines around her mouth drawn tight with fear and anger. "I didn't do this for a debt," he said, his voice low but firm, each word weighted with the years he'd spent in silence. "I did it because no one deserves to be treated like that. Not you. Not anyone." For a moment they just stood there, the cold wind whipping between them, pulling at the loose ends of their coats, the thin morning light casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Then Silas reached up, adjusting the brim of his hat, and swung into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He held out a calloused hand, his eyes steady on hers. "Come on," he said, his voice softer now, the rough edges smoothed by something that felt almost like regret. "Let's get you out of this cold." Martha hesitated, her eyes flicking to the crowd still lingering at the edges of the square, their breath misting in the air, eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment. She straightened, lifting her chin, and took his hand, her fingers cold and stiff against his. He pulled her up behind him, her slight weight settling against his back, her hands gripping the edge of the saddle as he clicked his tongue and nudged the mule into motion. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the crunch of hooves against frozen ground, and the slow, steady rhythm of their breaths mingling in the frigid air. The town fell away behind them, the narrow streets and leaning buildings swallowed by the shadows of the surrounding hills, the wind whispering through the bare branches overhead. As they reached the crest of the ridge overlooking Silas's small weathered cabin, he felt Martha's grip tighten against his coat, her fingers curling into the worn fabric as the cabin came into view. One chimney, one well, a single gnarled tree standing sentinel beside the unmarked grave at its roots. Silas dismounted slowly, his right leg stiff, the pain radiating up his thigh with each step. He reached up, his hand rough and scarred, and helped Martha down, her skirts brushing against his knee as she stepped lightly onto the frozen ground. She took a step back, her eyes sweeping over the small cabin, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, the rough, hand-cut logs still dark with the dampness of morning. Her breath came in short, shallow puffs, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, taking in every detail, every shadow, every crack in the warped wooden walls. "It's not much," Silas said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the cabin, the memories of long, cold winters and too many silent nights pressing against his chest. "But it's solid, warm enough once the fire's lit." Martha didn't respond, just took a slow step forward, her skirts rustling against the frozen grass, her breath misting in the cold air. She reached the porch, her hand brushing against the rough, weathered wood of the railing, her eyes flicking to the small stone marker beside the gnarled tree, the rough heart carved into its surface. Silas felt a tightness in his chest, his breath catching in his throat as he watched her. The memories of his wife's final days crowding his mind, the echoes of her laughter, the feel of her warm hand in his. He swallowed hard, the cold air biting at his throat, and took a slow, measured step forward. "You can take the bed," he said, his voice rough, each word dragging against his throat like a dull blade. "I'll sleep by the fire." Martha turned, her eyes meeting his, her expression unreadable in the gray morning light. For a moment he thought she might argue, might refuse the small comfort he offered, but she just nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, the words drifting into the cold, empty air like smoke from a dying fire. Silas nodded, the tightness in his chest easing just a fraction, and turned back toward the cabin, his boots thudding against the creaking boards as he crossed the threshold, the warmth of the dying fire wrapping around him like a thin, worn blanket. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches of the twisted tree, the small, unmarked grave at its roots shadowed by the gray morning light. The days after Martha's arrival passed in a slow, grinding rhythm, each hour marked by the crackle of the hearth and the creak of old floorboards beneath worn boots. The cabin settled into its new silence, not the hollow, echoing quiet of a man alone, but the tense, cautious stillness of two souls circling the edges of each other's grief. Martha moved like a ghost through the small cabin, her footsteps soft against the rough wood, her hands steady as she scrubbed the table, patched the torn quilts, and dusted the long-neglected shelves. Silas watched her in stolen glances, his eyes following the sharp, efficient movements of her hands, the way she tightened her jaw as she worked, her focus sharp and unyielding. He found himself speaking more than he had in years, small, practical words, the kind that fit neatly into the spaces between tasks. "Fire needs stoking. The roof leaks near the chimney. There's salt pork in the cellar." She never replied with more than a nod, her eyes rarely meeting his, but he felt the tension between them, a tight, fraying thread stretched thin over the long, quiet days. The snow came early that year, thick and heavy, falling in wet clumps that clung to the branches of the twisted tree beside Clara's grave, blanketing the rough-hewn roof in a shroud of white. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, rattling the windows and tugging at the loose ends of the roof shingles, the cold seeping into every corner, every crack, every breath. Silas chopped wood in the yard, his breath coming in sharp, white puffs, his shoulders aching with each swing of the axe, the rhythm of the blade biting into the frozen logs, the sharp crack of splintering wood, the creak of the axe handle in his calloused hands. All of it felt like a kind of prayer, a ritual against the creeping cold, a small act of defiance against the long, dark nights. Inside, Martha moved through the cabin like a shadow, her skirts whispering against the rough floorboards, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window as she watched him work, her hands wrapped tightly around the handle of the iron kettle she had just filled with snowmelt from the corner of the yard. As the snow piled higher, the cabin grew smaller, the walls closing in around them, the air thick with the mingled scents of smoke, wet wool, and simmering stew. They shared their meals in silence, the fire crackling softly beside them, the wind howling outside like a wolf denied its kill. It was on one of these long, silent nights, as the fire burned low and the wind lashed against the cabin walls, that Silas finally spoke, his voice rough and low, the words dragged from his throat like splinters. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames, the shadows dancing across his weathered face. "When you had the chance, why didn't you just keep running?" Martha looked up from the quilt she had been mending, her fingers stilling against the worn fabric, her eyes narrowing as she studied his profile, the sharp lines of his jaw, the deep grooves etched into his brow. "I had nowhere to run to," she replied, her voice quiet but steady, the words cutting through the crackling fire like the edge of a well-honed blade. "No one to turn to, no one to trust." Silas felt the words hit him, the truth of them settling into his bones like the deep ache of an old wound. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days, the firelight casting shadows across her face, sharpening the angles of her jaw, the thin line of her mouth. "You got a place now," he said, his voice rough but steady, the words falling heavy into the narrow space between them. "A roof over your head, food on the table, warmth in the fire. That's more than most have." She held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes dark and unreadable, the firelight flickering in their depths. Then she looked away, her fingers tightening around the quilt, her shoulders stiffening beneath the worn wool of her shawl. "I'll earn my keep," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the words clipped and precise, each one a small, sharp blade. "I don't want charity." Silas felt a flicker of something in his chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe, a memory of warm hands and soft laughter, of a voice that had once filled the cabin with songs and whispered promises. He turned back to the fire, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists against his knees. "Ain't charity," he muttered, his voice low, the words barely more than a growl. "It's just what's right." The wind outside screamed against the walls, the shutters rattling in their frames, the snow piling higher against the cabin's walls, sealing them in together, two ghosts clinging to the edges of a long, dark winter. The days stretched into weeks, the snow piling higher, the cold seeping deeper into the cabin's bones, the fire burning low and sullen in the hearth. Silas worked through the long, gray mornings, his breath misting in the frigid air, his axe biting into the frozen wood, his hands cracking and bleeding from the cold. Martha moved through the cabin like a wraith, her footsteps light, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window as she watched the snow fall, her hands red and raw from scrubbing, sewing, mending, tending to the small, quiet tasks that filled the long, silent days. They spoke little, their words measured and careful, each one a small, sharp blade, cutting through the cold, empty air. But in the long, dark nights, as the fire burned low and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, they shared a quiet, fragile peace, a silence that held the weight of years, the echo of old wounds and half-forgotten promises. And as the winter deepened, as the snow piled higher and the cold sank deeper into their bones, they found themselves leaning into that silence, their breaths mingling in the cold, empty air, their shadows stretching long across the rough, splintered floorboards. The snow had come down in thick, relentless sheets, covering the world in a cold, white silence. The twisted tree beside Clara's grave wore a heavy cloak of ice, its gnarled branches bent beneath the weight, creaking like old bones in the wind. The cabin, too, groaned beneath the burden, the roof sagging in the middle, smoke trailing weakly from the chimney as if struggling to rise against the cold. Silas sat by the fire, his boots propped against the stone hearth, his hands wrapped around a chipped tin mug of bitter black coffee. The flames crackled and spat, throwing long shadows against the rough log walls, their flickering light dancing across the worn floorboards, the battered table, the stacked wood piled high beside the door. Martha moved quietly in the corner, her skirts whispering against the floor as she ladled stew from the iron pot into two chip bowls, her breath misting in the cold air despite the fire's warmth. She set the bowls on the table without a word, her eyes fixed on the small, flickering flames, her jaw set, her hands red and raw from scrubbing and mending, and the constant, bitter cold. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against ceramic, the low crackle of the fire, the distant moan of the wind outside. The snow had buried the world, sealing them in together, their breaths mingling in the narrow space between them, the air thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged fears. Silas glanced up, his eyes catching the thin line of Martha's jaw, the sharp, determined set of her mouth, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the bowl, as if bracing herself against some unseen blow. He felt the tightness in his chest again, the slow, creeping burn of anger and regret, the echo of years spent alone, his world reduced to the crackle of fire and the slow, steady creak of floorboards beneath worn boots. The wind outside screamed, rattling the loose shutters, the snow piled high against the cabin's walls, sealing them in, cutting them off from the world beyond. Silas set his bowl down, the ceramic clinking against the rough wood, and leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Martha's profile, the firelight casting shadows across her sharp, angular face. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, his voice low, rough, the words dragging against his throat like a dull blade. "About going somewhere else, starting over." Martha's hands stilled, her spoon hovering above the bowl, her eyes flicking to his, sharp and unreadable in the flickering light. She set the spoon down slowly, her fingers curling into fists against the rough tabletop, her breath misting in the cold air. "I tried that once," she replied, her voice quiet but steady, each word a small, sharp blade, cutting through the crackling fire and the howling wind. "Ran as far as my feet would take me, got as far as the river before they caught me, brought me back in chains." Silas felt the words hit him, the truth of them settling into his bones like the deep ache of an old wound. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers curling around the chipped edge of his tin mug, his jaw tightening as the memories of his own long, lonely years crowded his mind. "You ain't chained now," he said, his voice rough, the words falling heavy into the narrow space between them. "Ain't nobody here to tell you what you can and can't do. You got your freedom now." Martha's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing, the firelight flickering in their depths, casting long shadows against her sharp cheekbones, the thin, pale line of her mouth. She looked away, her gaze settling on the small, square window beside the door, the glass fogged with frost, the world beyond a blur of white and gray and shadow. "Freedom," she whispered, her voice low, bitter, the words slipping from her lips like a curse. "What good is freedom when there's nowhere to run to, when every road leads back to the same place, the same chains?" Silas felt the tightness in his chest deepen, the slow, burning anger flaring in his veins, his fists clenching against the rough wood of the table, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to shout, but the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground outside stopped him cold. He straightened, his eyes snapping to the door, the shadowed crack beneath it, the thin line of light stretching across the rough, splintered floorboards. The hoofbeats grew louder, the sound sharp and urgent in the cold, still air, the snow crunching beneath iron shoes, the creak of leather, and the low, muffled voices of men. Martha stiffened, her eyes wide, her fingers clenching around the edge of the table, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked at Silas, her eyes sharp with fear and anger, the color draining from her cheeks, her lips parting in a silent question. Silas stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floorboards, the muscles in his legs protesting the sudden movement, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his boots thudding against the rough wood, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. He reached the door, his hand closing around the rough, iron handle, his heart pounding in his chest, the blood roaring in his ears. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the cold metal, his breath misting in the cold air, his eyes fixed on the thin line of light stretching across the floor, the shadows flickering at its edges. The hoofbeats slowed, the creak of leather, the jingle of metal, the low, muffled voices drawing closer, the air thick with the sharp, bitter scent of sweat and hoarse and cold steel. Silas tightened his grip on the door handle, his jaw clenching, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Then the voices reached the porch, the sound of boots crunching against the frozen ground, the low creak of the porch boards beneath their weight, the sharp metallic clink of spurs against weathered wood. Silas felt his heart stop, the air freezing in his lungs, his fingers tightening around the cold iron handle. He leaned his head forward, his ear pressed against the rough wood, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts, his mind racing, his heart pounding, the blood roaring in his ears. And then, a voice, low and sharp, cutting through the cold, still air. The words slipping through the thin crack beneath the door like a blade. "Mr. Boone," the voice said, rough and cold and sharp, the words dragging against the rough wood like a dull blade. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Silas's breath hung in the cold air, misting against the cracked glass of the cabin window as he watched the men approach. 3 figures moved through the snow, their shapes dark against the endless white, their horses blowing steam into the frozen morning. The man in the lead wore a long, black coat, the edges stiff with frost, his hat pulled low over sharp, calculating eyes. The 2 behind him rode close, their rifles slung across their chests, the butts worn smooth from use. Silas stepped back from the window, his jaw tightening, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. His hand closed around the worn stock of his shotgun, the smooth wood warm beneath his calloused fingers, the metal barrel cold against his palm. He glanced at Martha, her thin frame framed by the firelight, her eyes wide, her mouth set in a hard, determined line. "They're here," he said, his voice low, the words dragging against his throat like the sharp edge of a dull blade. Martha stiffened, her hands clenching around the edge of the rough wooden table, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked at him, her eyes sharp and bright, her jaw tightening, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows against her pale cheeks. "I won't go back," she whispered, her voice low, the words cutting through the crackle of the fire, the distant howl of the wind. "Not to them, not to that life." Silas met her eyes, the tightness in his chest easing just a fraction, the slow, creeping burn of anger flaring in his veins, his fingers tightening around the shotgun stock. "Then we stand," he replied, his voice rough, the words falling heavy into the narrow space between them, the fire crackling at his back, the wind howling outside like a wolf denied its kill. The first knock rattled the door, the sound sharp and sudden in the cold, still air, the wood shuddering beneath the force. Silas stepped forward, his boots thudding against the creaking floorboards, his breath coming in slow, measured breaths, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. "Mr. Boone," the voice came again, sharp and cold, the words slipping through the thin crack beneath the door like a blade. "We don't want no trouble. Just come out and hand over the girl, and we'll leave you be." Silas felt his jaw clench, his teeth grinding together, the tightness in his chest flaring into a sharp, burning ache. He reached for the latch, his fingers tightening around the cold iron handle, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled the door open, the cold air rushing in, cutting through the warmth of the cabin, the snow swirling around his boots, the wind whipping at his coat, the frozen ground crunching beneath the men's boots as they stepped forward, their eyes sharp, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. "Morning," Silas said, his voice low and steady, the words slipping from his lips like smoke, his eyes narrowing as he met the sharp, calculating gaze of the man in the black coat. The man smiled, his teeth white against the dark, weathered lines of his face, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath his boots, the leather of his coat creaking in the cold air. "Mr. Boone," the man said, his voice low and smooth, the words dripping with false warmth, his eyes flicking to the shotgun in Silas's hand, the barrel resting lightly against his shoulder. "I hear you've taken in a stray, a girl what don't belong to you. Seems a bit forward, don't you think?" Silas felt his jaw tighten, his fingers flexing against the worn stock of the shotgun, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. He met the man's eyes, the fire in his chest flaring, his blood roaring in his ears, his muscles coiling like a spring. "She ain't yours either," he replied, his voice low but firm, the words falling heavy into the cold, still air, the wind howling around them, the snow crunching beneath their boots, the distant crackle of the fire echoing through the narrow cabin doorway. The man's smile widened, his eyes narrowing, his hand dropping slowly to the butt of his pistol, his fingers curling around the worn, polished grip, the leather of his coat creaking as he leaned forward, his breath misting in the cold air. "You got a choice, Boone," he said, his voice low, the words slipping from his lips like a snake's hiss. "Hand her over, or we take her ourselves. One way or another, she's coming with us." Silas felt the tightness in his chest flare into a sharp, burning rage, his fingers tightening around the shotgun stock, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing as he met the man's cold, calculating gaze. "No," he said, his voice low and rough, the words cutting through the cold, still air like a blade. "She ain't going nowhere. Not with you. Not ever." The man's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, his fingers flexing around the butt of his pistol, the leather of his coat creaking as he straightened, his breath misting in the cold air, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he took a slow, measured step back. "So be it," he whispered, his voice low, the words slipping from his lips like a death sentence, his eyes cold and sharp, his fingers tightening around the pistol's grip, the muscles in his arm coiling like a spring. The world exploded into noise and fire, the shotgun bucking against Silas's shoulder, the sharp crack of the blast echoing through the snow-covered trees, the air thick with the bitter, metallic scent of gunpowder, the sharp, stinging bite of the cold cutting through the smoke. The man in the black coat stumbled back, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open, a dark, wet stain spreading across the front of his coat, the snow beneath his boots turning a deep, wet red. Silas stepped back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his fingers tightening around the shotgun stock, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing as the two men behind the leader reached for their guns, their fingers fumbling with the worn leather of their holsters, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The shotgun roared again, the blast tearing through the cold, still air, the snow crunching beneath Silas's boots as he stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, his blood roaring in his ears, his breath misting in the cold air. When the smoke cleared, the men lay in the snow, their bodies twisted and still, their eyes wide, their mouths hanging open, their breaths coming in short, shallow gasps before falling silent, the snow beneath them turning a deep, wet red. Silas stood over them, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his fingers tightening around the shotgun stock, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the bodies. The blood spreading slowly through the snow, the wind howling around him, the cabin door creaking in the cold, still air. Behind him, Martha stepped out onto the porch, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her jaw set, her fingers clenching around the edge of her shawl. Silas turned slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his heart pounding in his chest, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze, the fire in his chest flaring, the tightness in his chest easing just a fraction. "We're free," he whispered, his voice low, the words slipping from his lips like a prayer, the snow crunching beneath his boots, the wind howling around them, the fire crackling softly in the cabin behind them, the smoke rising slowly into the cold, clear morning sky. Thank you for riding with us through the snow and silence of Silas and Martha's journey. In a world where freedom is hard-won and trust comes slowly, They found a fragile peace in the cold, relentless winter. But what would you have done in their place? Would you have stood your ground or taken the risk to run? Let me know in the comments, would you have trusted Silas as Martha did or kept running? Do you think they truly found freedom, or is the past still waiting for them? What would you like to see in their future now that the snow has thawed and the danger has passed? And if you enjoyed this tale of survival and second chances, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to stay with us on every ride through the Wild West. Thanks for watching, and keep your fire burning.